Great Expectations. The Charles Dickens Children's Collection. Pip Meets a Convict. This story is about Philip Pirrip. Everyone called him Pip. He couldn't remember his mother and father because they died when he was very young. Pip's sister, who was 20 years older, took on the task of bringing up young Pip. She was married to Joe Gargery, a strong, kind man with fair, curly hair and blue eyes. Joe was a blacksmith in the village, which lay on the flat and marshy Thames estuary, not too far from the sea. Joe was big and strong, but he was a little frightened of his wife. Pip was frightened of her too. Mrs. Joe, that's what everyone called her, was quick to fight with both Pip and Joe. She fought with words, and sometimes even with a cane. Though Pip couldn't remember his parents, sometimes he went to the churchyard and gazed at their gravestones. Pip was in the churchyard one Christmas Eve. The day was growing darker and he shivered as the wind rushed in from the river. He was feeling sorry for himself and began to cry. "Hold your noise," cried a terrible voice. A huge man sprang up from among the gravestones. He was dressed in ragged gray clothes. He was wet and muddy, and shivering. Worst of all, he had an iron chain locking his ankles together. "What's your name, boy?" "Pip, sir." "Where do you live?" His hand trembling, the boy pointed to his village about a mile off. "Where's your mother and father?" growled the man. "There," said Pip, nodding towards the tombstones. "I live with my sister, Mrs. Joe. She's married to Joe Gargery, the blacksmith." "Blacksmith, eh?" said the man, looking at the chain around his ankles. He stretched out his large hands and squeezed Pip hard by the cheeks. "Here's what you're going to do, boy. Go home and bring me back some food and a file tomorrow morning. If you don't, I might just eat you instead, starting with these fat cheeks of yours." Pip ran home in terror. His sister was on the rampage and started shouting at him. She stamped her foot, shook her fist and screeched questions about what mischief he had been up to. Later, during tea, Pip managed to hide a slice of bread and butter for the gray man on the marshes. In the distance, they heard the booming sound of a cannon being fired. Joe said it came from the prison ship moored in the estuary. It meant that a prisoner, a convict, had escaped. Pip hardly slept that night. Very early on Christmas morning, he crept downstairs and took some cheese, a little brandy in a bottle and a beautiful round pork pie from his sister's pantry. He ran through the misty morning until he found the gray man. Seizing the food and drink, the man gulped it down like a starving dog. Pip plucked up the courage to say, "I am glad you enjoyed it." In reply, the man made a strange clicking sound in his throat. He demanded the file taken from Joe's workshop, then seemed to forget about the boy. When Pip left, the man was filing away furiously at the chain around his legs. Mrs. Joe had guests for Christmas dinner. One of them was Mr. Pumblechook, Joe's uncle, who had a mouth like a fish. He and the other grown-ups lectured Pip about how grateful he should be to his sister for bringing him up. Worse followed when Mrs. Joe went to fetch the pork pie from the pantry. Pip knew the pork pie had been swallowed almost in one gulp by the man on the marshes. At any moment his sister would return empty-handed and on the rampage. Pip thought it best not to be there when this happened. He broke away from the dinner table and ran to the front door. Straight into a group of soldiers. One of them, a sergeant, was holding a pair of handcuffs. Thankfully, they were not looking for a pork pie thief, but for the escaped convict from the prison ship. Everyone was excited at the prospect of hunting down a fugitive. Only kind-hearted Joe whispered to Pip that he hoped the prisoner would not be found. Pip hoped so too. Joe and Pip set off with the soldiers and a handful of people from the village. It was cold and dreary, and Joe carried the boy on his back over banks and across ditches. There was a sudden cry of alarm to their right. It didn't come from the soldiers. They headed towards the sound. A man was floundering in a patch of swampy ground, about to be sucked under. It was dark now, but even without seeing him clearly, Pip knew that it was the man in gray. 3 soldiers dragged him from the muddy bog. When they had brought him out, he was so covered in slime that you could not tell the difference between the mud and the rags he wore. He looked up and saw Pip, who shook his head slightly. The boy didn't want the mud-covered man to think that he'd led the soldiers to him. "We've got you now, Abel Magwitch," said the sergeant. "I want to say something, in case anyone else gets the blame," said the prisoner. "I broke into a blacksmith's close by. I stole a file and a pork pie." "You are welcome to the pork pie," said Joe. "Whatever you've done, we wouldn't have you starve to death." The convict said nothing, but again came that strange clicking sound from his throat. It was as if no one had ever said a kind word to him before. The sergeant and the soldiers led him away. "What will happen to him, Joe?" Pip whispered. "It'll be back to the prison ship for Mr. Magwitch," said Joe. "And then he'll be taken to Australia." "Australia? Where's that?" "Not sure, Pip. A long way off, though." Pip fell asleep as Joe carried him home on his back. Saddest house. Pip never really thought about what he was going to do in his life. The reason he never thought about it was because he already knew. He was going to be a blacksmith like Joe. Pip had already started helping Joe in the smithy. Things quickly changed when Mr. Pumblechook announced that Pip had been invited to meet a rich lady. She lived in the market town nearby. Her name was Miss Havisham, and she wanted a little boy to go and play at her grand house. Mrs. Joe said this was a fine thing. Mr. Pumblechook said this was a fine thing. No one asked Pip what he thought. He was washed and scrubbed and dressed up in his smartest clothes. Then Mr. Pumblechook drove him in his carriage to Miss Havisham's house. It had a strange name, Saddest House. Through a fence of iron bars Pip could see a courtyard. All the windows on the ground floor had iron bars on, too. Mr. Pumblechook rang a bell by the gate. After a while, a young girl strolled across the courtyard holding a bunch of keys. She let Pip in, but told Mr. Pumblechook he wasn't wanted by Miss Havisham. At this news, Mr. Pumblechook's mouth looked more fish-like than ever. The girl said almost nothing, apart from telling Pip to hurry up. She called him boy, even though they were about the same age. But she was so beautiful and confident that she seemed much, much older. Inside the house, it was dark. The girl picked up a burning candle and they weaved their way through a maze of passages until they came to a door. "Go in," she said. "After you, miss." "Don't be ridiculous, boy." "I am not going in." Half afraid, Pip knocked on the door and was told to enter. The room was large and well lit with candles. Heavy curtains covered the windows. In an armchair sat the strangest lady Pip had ever seen. A white veil dangled from her white hair. She was dressed all in white. Jewels sparkled on her neck and hands. "You are the boy sent by Pumblechook?" "Yes, ma'am." "I am Pip." "Come closer," she demanded. As he drew near, Pip saw that her long white dress was faded and yellow with age. "How old are you, Pip?" "8, ma'am." "I have not seen the light of the sun since you were born, Pip." Since Pip didn't know what to say, he said nothing. Then Miss Havisham told him to summon Estella. Very uncertain, Pip went to the door and called Estella into the dark corridor. He was pleased to see the beautiful young girl arrive back, holding her candle. Miss Havisham wanted to watch Estella and Pip play cards together. The only game he knew was a simple one called Beggar My Neighbor. Estella beat him at several games. She didn't smile once in all the time they played. She made rude remarks about Pip's clumsy hands. Finally, Pip was allowed to go home, but told to come back again in a few days. Estella almost pushed him out of the iron front gate and then locked it firmly. Pip was pleased to leave, but sad, too. It was nice to have someone to play with. Back home, Mrs. Joe and Rolo Pumblechook peppered Pip with questions about Miss Havisham and Satis house. Pip made up a story about how Miss Havisham was tall and sat on a velvet couch. From the way